Hi, my name is Karl Chen, and I'll be talking about automatic imports today. So this is actually my first time to India. It's a really beautiful country. I love it here. Wish I could stay here even longer. And it's also my first PyCon, so a little nervous here. So who am I? I've been using Python for 20 years. I work at D.E. Shaw. It's a quantitative hedge fund. That means we use computer algorithms to trade stocks and other financial instruments. And I have two jobs. My primary job is I work in the asset management group. So we do active equity and asset allocation. We manage about 24 billion US dollars, which is about 1.7 lakh crore. The kind of stuff I've done there is created our equity risk model. I created our asset allocation optimizer, things like that. And my second job is I run the core Python infrastructure group at D.E. Shaw. And we have about 10 people, 10 lakh lines of code. So one of the things I love about Python is that it has very little boilerplate. But there's one place where there is a lot of boilerplate, which is import statements. And typing all these import statements is very tedious. It's almost copy and pasting, except it's a lot of fragments of copy and pasting, so you can't just copy and paste the whole block. It's tedious when you're using IPython, Jupyter Notebook. It's tedious when you're writing modules and scripts. It also tends to get stale over time. So every time you modify your module, you add some more imports, and you don't remember to remove the old imports that are not needed anymore, and it just gets very crufty. And star imports in general are bad, and I'll talk more about why that is. So what do people do to deal with import statements? So interactively, what a lot of people do initially is just put a bunch of stuff into your IPython startup file. And that works, but it doesn't work very well. So the first problem you see is that it ends up being very slow. So this, if your workflow is just to start one IPython notebook and use it for a week, then it's okay. But for a lot of workflows, you have to start new IPython sessions, new Python processes all the time, and then it just gets too slow. Another problem is a lot of modules, or some modules have naughty side effects. Like they do something that you don't want to do in every IPython session. So the next thing people try to do is proxy objects. So Python is very good at letting you do hacky, magical things. And a common trick is to create a class where the instance looks like a module, but it's not actually a module, and it automatically imports things lazily on demand. That works for some cases, but when you get into the edge cases, you start getting a lot of problems, a lot of things that don't work. So a lot of people use star imports. So for example, maybe you want to use Pylab or NumPy, and you don't want to type from NumPy import a range, from NumPy import array all the time. So you just say from NumPy import star. But the problem with that is that also imports numpy.all into your namespace. And then you start getting weird errors later that you can't figure out. In modules and scripts in production code is particularly bad because you can't tell what's shadowing what. And it means your ordering matters. You might have two modules that have different symbols and one shadows another. And if you're modifying or somebody else modifies a module, that's going to break your code because let's say they import sys or OS and you import star from this other module, so that imports sys and OS, and you use it without realizing that you're relying on that. And then when they remove it because they don't need it anymore, now your code breaks. So I built a solution. The project is called Pyflyby, and it automates imports. So it has a few different killer features. There's interactive mode, there's command line script, and it automatically edits your modules and scripts. So here's an example. When you're in IPython or Jupyter, you can just type your code as if you don't need to import anything, because you don't. So if you're trying to use pylab.figure, you don't need to say import pylab. You just type pylab.figure, and Pyflyby will automatically import pylab on demand just before it's needed. And it works with all types of imports. So another example is I want to do np.power of 2, a range 4, and Pyflyby will automatically do those imports for you. It's fully integrated into Jupyter Notebook. If I type nump tab, then it auto-completes that without having to import NumPy first. If I type numpy.arrang tab, then it will import NumPy at that moment, because that's needed to figure out what the symbols in there are, and then it will auto-complete arange. And it works with the question mark pinfo operator. It works with magic commands like timeit. You can use it with %run. It will automatically import anything needed to run some code fragment in a file. It works in both console mode and in Notebook. Pyflyby works with debugging, and that's extremely useful. So if you want to do %debug, that works with automatic imports. If you're in the debugger already, the automatic imports are particularly useful, because all the other tricks you might do, like putting stuff into your IPython starter file, won't work there, because in the debugger you're in the namespace of whatever code frame you're debugging. So how does Pyflyby figure out where to get the imports? So you maintain that yourself. There's a database, which is just a py file. The syntax is regular Python. That code is not executed by Pyflyby, but it should be code that could run in Python. When you first start using Pyflyby, there's a script you can use to scan all your existing code, and it will collect all the imports that you're already using, and you can make that your database. And then from then on, you would manually maintain it. The way Pyflyby works is it hooks into IPython. It parses the abstract syntax tree, figures out what's an unknown symbol, and imports them using the known imports database. And figuring out what's a unknown symbol is pretty tricky. So you have to kind of implement a lot of the Python logic internally. Pyflyby also has a command line script. So if you want to do one-liners in Python, it's a buzzkill when you have to type import statements in your command line one-liner. And this just lets you not have to do all those import statements. Another important feature of Pyflyby is a script called tidy imports. Tidy imports modifies your Python code, your modular script, to add all the imports that you're missing and also remove unnecessary imports. So here I have an example Python script, and it has just before I ran tidy imports, it just said np.power of 2, a range 4. Then tidy imports figured out which imports needed to be added and added them. Here's an example of removing an unnecessary import. So before I ran tidy imports in this example, the code had a import for array, and that's not used by the code, so it automatically removes that. So Tidy imports completely manages all your import statements. It adds missing imports, removes unnecessary imports. It canonicalizes the whole import stanza. Sometimes you have multiple multiple definitions of one symbol. So if your import database has conflicts, then tidy imports, the Pyflyby will just tell you what all the choices are. A minor feature is you can configure tidy imports in Pyflyby to have mandatory imports. So let's say you always want to have certain future imports in all your modules, then you can say what you want. And here's an example. Say for Python 2, you want to always have from future import absolute import and division, then that will do that automatically. Another minor feature is you can canonicalize imports. So sometimes there are some import conventions that you want to change. Let's say it's better to just say from SQL Alchemy import table instead of from SQL Alchemy.sql.schema import table. Then you can have this automate that in all your code. As I mentioned, star imports are bad generally, so there's a mode for tidy imports that will replace your star import with the things that are actually needed. And this is the only mode of running tidy imports that will actually execute any user code. So to do this, it will have to import Pylab, but just in general, just to figure out which imports are needed and not needed, it doesn't have to execute any code, any user code. There are a lot of places you can put your Pyflyby configuration, your known imports database. So you can put it in your home directory. You can also have per project or per directory configuration. So if I have a symbol called simulation and 2 different projects and they're supposed to be different things, then you can have a database per project. It's also common for large organizations to have shared Pyflyby known imports databases. So for example, we could have so D SHA has a firm-wide one that most people use, and then individual groups customize that a little bit, and then individual people customize their group ones a little bit. So there are a couple ways you can inherit known import databases. The inheritance is basically just merging all of the imports into one database. One issue with that is that you might be inheriting some imports that most people want, but you don't want. You want something different. So there's also an option to just remove 1 or 2 imports that you're inheriting. Tidy imports has a lot of formatting options. A lot of people are particular about how they want to align their import statements or line wrap and things like that. So tidy import can support all those options. So I developed Pyflyby as a side project outside of work many years ago. At the time, I had enough energy to work 60 hours and then do random programming stuff outside of work. Then my responsibilities at work increased and I had kids, and then I stopped doing side projects for a while. Eventually, D SHA decided that this shouldn't be a side project anymore, it should be an official project. So now it is, and I've open sourced it. So D SHA has hundreds of programmers and quants, people who write code in Python, and almost everybody uses it. In some groups, it's a requirement to use it to make sure your imports are clean. And it's super reliable. A lot of people don't even look at the import statements at the top anymore. So now I'll talk about how Pyflyby has helped D SHA improve code quality. So the obvious superficial thing is that import statements are a lot cleaner. You don't have a bunch of redundant things. You don't have stale imports that are not needed anymore. And the whole thing is sorted and canonicalized and pretty. Python also, because it's a dynamic language, sometimes you can have a missing import that you don't know about until you run into some code branch, and this also takes care of that. Pyflyby has also helped standardize coding conventions. So, for example, at DESHA we have a module called desha.constants.strategy, and that module has a global function called get. So there are a lot of different ways people use this. Some people would say from desha.constants import strategy, strategy.get. Some people would say from desha.constant.strategy import get. And those are not very good because it pollutes your global namespace with something called get, which doesn't make any sense later in the code. And having a global symbol called strategy with lowercase s is also not very good because that's usually a variable name. So then people start getting creative, like from the desha.constants.strategy import get as get underscore strategy, and then you just start getting a proliferation because everybody's doing something different. So Pyflyby, we put in from desha.constants.strategy import, there's a typo here, from desha.constants import strategy as uppercase S strategy. So then everybody uses this, and it standardizes coding conventions. So actually, eventually we decided, well, that should just be the API, the official API. So now there's a class called strategy with an uppercase S, and you just say from desha.constants.import strategy, uppercase S, and we don't have any of these different variants anymore. So this is the recommended way to design Python APIs, to not do things hierarchically, because if you have hierarchical names, you can't import things globally. And because Pyflyby really encourages you to not do a lot of imports all the time, just kind of do things automatically, then it encourages having a single global namespace. So it encourages you to have things like a class strategy uppercase S. Pyflyby also has prevented people from doing these star imports, which are bad. So now you don't have any incentive to do from NumPy import star anymore. You can just type array without doing any imports, and that's automatic. Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, hi Karl. So I have a question. Can I clean my imports giving command with the whole workspace? So can I write tidy imports my workspace, and it goes through each and every file and fixing my imports?
Yes, there are different ways you can run the command line script. The default is the interactive mode, where it'll print out a diff and then ask you to confirm, and then you press yes and it replaces it. You can also just replace it without confirmation. So what you can do is run it on all your py files without confirmation, and then do a git diff at the end to confirm.
So I can give the workspace name as well, right?
It doesn't take a directory name, but you can just do */*star.py to run it recursively on all py files in your workspace.
Okay, and the second question is, let's say I have a pylint where I have defined that maximum characters in a single line, let's say 50 characters. So does your Pyflyby takes care of it and breaks that single import into multiple lines?
Can you repeat the question?
So let's say I have a pylint, I have made a rule, like in a single line, I have 80 characters I can embed in a one line.
Uh-huh.
And does your flyby takes care of that particular lint rule, and it breaks that import statement into a multiple lines, or it ignores it?
Yes, you can configure that. The default is that it will line wrap at 80 characters, and it will line up all the import statements.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, does this work for user-defined functions? Suppose I have 10 Python files with different functions. Will this import the user-defined files also?
Yes, it works with any imports. So, we have 10 log lines of code. That's like, you could say that's all user-defined, right? So we have import databases for all of that.
Suppose here NumPy you are importing as NP. Suppose if I want to import it as NPY, where do I modify it? Suppose in all my code I want to use it as NPY.
So that's where the import database comes in. So here as an example, I just have a very short 4-line import database. The actual import databases we have are hundreds or thousands of entries, but here I just have 4 things. So if you want NPY, you would just say import NumPy as NPY in this file.
Okay, got it. Thanks.